Everybody who doesn't do oral history collection and community collection thinks it's just as easy as you call somebody, you record their story, and then you have it. And it's not nearly that easy.
From the Society of American Archivists, student chapter at the University of Alabama, this is Archives and Communities, a podcast highlighting community archiving initiatives and the people behind them.
Hello, my name is Aria Skyler, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Matthew Stiffler, the Research and Content Manager at the Arab American National Museum in Michigan, a museum, archive, and outreach center dedicated to the Arab American community. Its mission is to preserve and present the culture and contributions of Arab Americans throughout history. Matthew, whose ancestors were Lebanese and Italian immigrants, begins the interview by telling me a little bit about his background and how he came to be interested in working with community archiving.
So I grew up in Western Pennsylvania in a small town called Johnstown. And within that town, there was a small Lebanese and Syrian Christian population, of which I was a part of. And so I grew up within this community of folks, folks that spoke Arabic, some folks who were immigrants, mainly people like myself who maybe their grandparents or great grandparents were the immigrants, but we still sort of maintained our heritage and our culture. And so I grew up in that. And then I went off to graduate school in Utah to get my master's in American culture. And then for my PhD at University of Michigan, I focused on Arab Americans, history and culture. And so that brought my sort of life experiences into my academic work. And then when I finished my PhD, I started working at the Arab American National Museum in Dearborn, where I've been for 11 years. And at the museum, I oversee our library and archive, including our oral history collections. And I work with curatorial on exhibits, and I work with education on programming and outreach. So I kind of have my hand in a lot of different things.
A little bit of everything.
At the museum. Yeah, it's really a dream position.
That's amazing. So that you told us about your current position. Anything else about your professional path that you want to talk about?
So in my graduate training at Michigan, I was on the track to be a tenure track professor. That's kind of all they were training us to be at that time. This was the mid 2000s, and it was very much like you're going to work at a Research One institution as a tenure track professor. And then the financial crash happened in 08, 09, and nobody was getting jobs anymore. And so I was like, well, that's probably not going to happen. And so luckily, the museum was only about 40 miles from where I was going to graduate school, and they happened to be hiring. And I said, this looks like a great career path. And so I jumped into community history and exhibits, and it's been amazing. And I probably, wouldn't go back to academia even with a good offer.
I'm still working on that path too. Academic, public, museums. I meant to ask this earlier. You said your ancestors were immigrants?
So on my mother's side, her family came from Lebanon, but like 100 years ago.
Okay.
So I'm like fourth generation. On my dad's side, his mom was an Italian immigrant, but that's a whole different thing.
So could you share with us what community archiving means to you, and how did you become interested in community archiving?
So in graduate school, I used archives a lot, mainly institutional archives of churches and organizations and social clubs. And then when I started at the museum, I realized that the only way we could do our exhibits, the only way we can do our educational outreach is if we have stories of individuals and stories of families. And the only way to get those is to go and meet with people across the country, collect their stories orally, get family photographs and documents and objects. And so I realized that if you want to tell any story of an ethnic community, in our case, the Arab American community, it has to start with individual and family narratives. We've been trying to increase our oral history collection. We're always collecting new family stories and family artifacts to make sure that our exhibits and collections reflect the breadth and depth of the community.
So you travel a lot?
Used to, pre-pandemic, not a lot.
Right.
I mean, We did, but yeah, because this was before people thought, oh, you could do oral histories on Zoom, right? That was always considered like a stopgap measure. And so, yes, we would travel locally, we would fly, either we would fly or we would have a videographer in a different area do the work for us. But yeah, we had, we're a national museum. And so our community is national. So it's a little more difficult to do everything in person from one location.
No, that makes sense. I'm still new at this and figuring that out. I'm like, you know what? That makes sense now that I've asked that question.
But we've done
Um,
like I did an oral history on Zoom with a 90-year-old. This guy was more tech savvy than me.
wow.
And this was just a few months ago, and he was in Florida and I'm in Michigan. And so it worked out really well that we did this like 2-hour oral history over Zoom, and it was fantastic. Being in person really wouldn't have changed anything.
That's amazing. Could you tell us more about the Arab American community and archiving and how you arrived at this idea? You've touched on it.
The Arab American community is very diverse. We're talking about a community that can be from any of the 22 Arab countries. They could be immigrants and refugees that showed up in the US like in the last year. They could be people whose families came 130 years ago. They live all over the country, have every kind of occupation you can imagine, the range of religious identities. It's not just Muslim and Christian. There's Jewish folks, there's Druze community, Mandaean, Yazidi, like you name it, there's the diversity. And so our task, which is extremely difficult, is not only represent like all that diversity, but represent the diversity across the United States. And so it's really tough. If you could do 100 oral histories with Arab Americans every year, it would still take you a few years till you felt like, oh yeah, I think our collection is really reflective of the diversity of the community.
So, do you have any advice for us emerging archivists interested in this kind of work?
Oh my, yes. It's the one thing I learned is everybody who doesn't do oral history collection and community collection thinks it's just as easy as you call somebody, you record their story, and then you have it. And it's not nearly that easy because it takes weeks. In a good case, it takes weeks just to get somebody on the phone and get them comfortable with the idea of recording their history. Then you have to set up a time where you have a sound person and a videographer. If you want like high quality audio and video, then you meet, you record the story, then you have to get the metadata for the story, then you have to put it into your collections, and then you have to process it, and then you do the transcription, and then you run it by the person who you interviewed. And it's like, it's so time consuming that for our small team, if we do like 2 or 3 a month, like we're exhausted. But what's funny is people outside of it think like, oh, all you're doing is you take a tape recorder, you ask somebody some questions, and then you've got their story. But it's so time consuming if you want to make the story usable and available to the public and to researchers. And so yeah, it's quite an involved process.
Wow. You're a small team and you take volunteers as well.
Yeah, we have volunteers, interns from different library and archive programs in the area. But yeah, the hardest part is that initial, you call somebody, you finally get a hold of somebody, and then you tell them you want to record their story, and they say, well, I don't really have a story to tell. You should talk to my cousin, or you should call this person. And I'm like, no, we want to talk to you. And then it's a few weeks till you can like get them to do it. And then yeah, it's
Right.
so time consuming. It's worth it. I mean, it's a very valuable process, but it's just much more work than most people think.
How focused is your archive on oral histories versus do you have a lot of physical donations that you get from families at all?
Yeah, I mean, our object collection is, probably about 5,000 objects. We've
Wow.
got tens of thousands of photos and documents in our manuscript collections. And, that stuff usually comes with a story. And so sometimes we'll do like a short recording of somebody, like, tell us about this object you're donating. It might be 5 or 10 minutes, but we really want to get like those full narratives of a family. And, we do that in many different ways, both locally and nationally, but it's tough for sure.
Are there any volunteer or internship options online at all?
So we haven't really done online volunteering yet. We're open to it. It's just it hasn't
Mhm.
really worked out. But we
Right.
have had a completely remote internship. The person was actually in Lebanon for the duration of the internship, but they actually did some oral histories from Lebanon with people in the United States. And we were trying to tell a story about a specific organization, and they tracked people down. They did interviews. They found archival photos, and from the interviews they did and the photos they had, they told these really great stories. And yeah, they did that completely remotely, which was surprising.
That's really cool. Is there anything else that you wanted to tell us about the Arab American National Museum? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, like, so the museum, like I said, is, we're in our 15th, 16th year of operation,
Mhm.
but we're part of an organization that's been around for 50 years. It's one of the largest Arab American organizations in the country, and it does everything from providing medical and mental health services to the community and immigration services and ESL classes. And then it's got this museum. So as a museum, we're situated within this like human services organization, which is quite unique and gives us access to the community in ways that most folks just wouldn't have.
Okay, I had no idea about that. That's really cool.
Yeah, it's an organization called Access, which used to stand for the Arab Community Center for Economic and Social Services, but now it's just Access for obvious reasons because it's too hard to say the full name. And yeah, and so it's amazing that you're part of this organization as a museum and cultural center that also does so many direct services to tens of thousands of folks in the Metro Detroit area.
It really is a community archive.
Very, yeah,
That's
exactly.
really cool. Well, that's all the questions I have. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
No, I'm glad to be included, and thanks for reaching out to us. I know we're well outside of the scope of Alabama, but there are historic Arab communities throughout Alabama. There are Lebanese and Syrian communities that have been there for since the late 1800s, and they've got some really cool stories. And we've collected some of them, but definitely not as many as we should.
What about Tennessee? That's where I'm at.
Oh, you're in Tennessee? Yes. In
I
fact, we were just
am.
talking about Tennessee today. So Tennessee has a large Kurdish population right now because of
Okay.
refugees, but they're not considered Arab. But we do have a collection from someone. Her name is Selwa Roosevelt. So she was born in Tennessee to Lebanese immigrant parents in the she's got to be 90. So like in the 30s maybe. And then she moved to Washington. She married a Roosevelt. And then she worked at the White House. She was the chief protocol officer for the White House under Reagan. So she was the person who knew all the rules of who sits where at a state dinner, how do you greet the foreign leader from a certain country. And, she was kind of a society person too. So she was in the news a lot. And she's this Lebanese American who, with a name like Selwa Roosevelt, doesn't really, you wouldn't think she is, but yeah, her
Right.
her parents settled in Tennessee and she lived much of her early life in Tennessee. So we're trying to digitize that collection and get it online. But yeah, so that's the Tennessee thing that actually popped up today. So
Interesting. Thank you so much.
I would like to thank Matthew for speaking with us today and sharing about the Arab American Museum and its community outreach services and the depth, diversity, and importance of the history of the Arab American community. If you would like to learn more, volunteer, or donate to the Arab American National Museum, information can be found in the description below. Thanks so much for listening to Archives and Communities.
This was an episode of Archives and Communities, the official podcast of the Society of American Archivists student chapter at the University of Alabama. Opinions expressed in this podcast are not reflective of a particular institution. Thank you for listening, and join us again next time.